Hello, dear viewers. Today we're going to be talking about South Asian countries and democracy within them. South Asia, South Asian countries became independent in the about 70 years ago with the end of the British Empire. The current political systems in Nepal and Bhutan began in 1950s. So basically, the modern history of uh, South Asian countries begins 70 years ago. When talking about democracy, I'll be talking about it from that date onwards. And I'll go through the countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka, and talk about how they've managed democracy, what the similarities are between each of them, the differences, and yeah, let's begin. Afghan Prime Minister Shah Mahmood allowed relatively free National Assembly elections, which resulted in the seven Afghan parliament, which reigned from 1949 to 51. This was known as the Liberal Parliament, which gave voice to criticism of the government and traditional institutions, allowed opposition political groups to come to life, and enacted some liberal reforms, including laws providing for a free press. However, then in 1952, there was a democracy receded because there was a government crackdown ending liberalization. University student unions in Kabul and Ghazni were dissolved, and newspapers critical of the government had been shut down. So this was a backsliding of democracy, and so this continued. This back and forth continued. Then in 1987, the Soviet-backed Afghan Communist government introduced a law permitting the formation of other political parties, announced that it would be prepared to share power with representatives of opposition groups in the event of a coalition government, and issued a new constitution provided for a new bicameral National Assembly consisting of a Senate and a House of Representatives, and a president to be indirectly elected for a 7-year term. So this is the real beginning of democracy. You can see came under the communists. It didn't work. It didn't get much support from the people because this was something imposed on them by a foreign sponsored government. And um, in 1988, elections were held for both houses of the new National Assembly, and the party called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan won 46 seats in the House of Representatives and controlled the government with support with another party called the National Front, which won 45 seats, and from various recognized left wing parties, which had won a total of 24 seats. The election was boycotted by Mujahideen, but the government left 50 of the 234 seats in the House of Representatives, as well as small number of seats in the Senate, vacant in the hope that the guerrillas would end their armed struggle and participate in the government. This was a good move, theoretically, to encourage the Mujahideen to uh, give up their violence and participate in democratic rule. Unfortunately, they didn't, and after the Soviet-backed government of Afghanistan was defeated by the Mujahideen, the Taliban took power in the 1990s. Then there was no democracy at all with the Taliban in power. Then from 2003 to 2021, and due to the largely illiterate nature of Afghan society, ballots during this era displayed images of the and so in 2004 there was a presidential election, and but parliamentary elections were not held until mid-September 2005. Hamid Karzai won the election with 55.4% of the vote. I was I have heard allegations that many people in Afghanistan believe that Hamid Karzai's elections victories were fraudulent. I don't have enough evidence to say that, but I just want to say, let you know that there was such a sentiment in Afghanistan. Then, on September 18, 2005, parliamentary and provincial council elections were held. These results were delayed by accusations of election fraud, and they were finally announced on November 12, 2005. Former warlords and their followers gained the majority of seats in both the lower house and the provincial council, and turnout was estimated about 50%, but much lower than the presidential election. This was blamed on the lack of an identifiable party list. And then there was a second presidential election in 2009. Presidential and provincial council elections held on August 20, 2009 were widely characterized as marred by utter electoral fraud. Fraud was so pervasive that nearly a quarter of all votes were thrown out, according to the New York Times. So, yeah, this is a problem with developing countries, not undeveloped countries, having democracy. There's corruption is very widespread, spread, and this affects the elections as well. And this hurts people's confidence in democracy at large. So and now of course it's pretty much over because the Taliban rule Afghanistan, and they show no signs of any having any elections in the future. Pakistan, uh, according to their founder Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he did want Pakistan to be a democracy, but also an Islamic state. And so, unfortunately, these two goals were somewhat contradictory because not everyone in Pakistan want a religious government. So, but and so they would not vote for Islamic party that would impose Islamic law on the country, and religious people, Islamists basically, would not approve of laws that were democratically established. They would want laws that came from the holy book, the Quran. So these two opposing sides have always been in conflict in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, sorry. We can see how in 1949 there was the first formal step to transform Pakistan into an ideological Islamic state. This was done by Liaquat Ali Khan, the first prime minister, who was appointed by President Jinnah. He introduced the Objectives Resolution in the Constituent Assembly, which declared that the sovereignty over the entire universe belonged to Allah Almighty, uh, a Deobandi alim scholar. So we can see that from the beginning, Islam was the dominant force in Pakistan, and this has prevented it from becoming a proper, full fledged democracy. And uh, then in 1958, military rule was imposed because President Iskandar Mirza ordered for massive mobilization of Pakistan armed forces and appointed Chief of Army Staff General Ayub Khan as the commander in chief. The president declared a state of emergency, imposed martial law, suspended the constitution, and dissolved both the socialist government in East Pakistan and the parliamentary government in West Pakistan. Now, this is the fact that the constitution gave such powers to the president is an error. They should not have allowed the president to have such power, which would have prevented these such a coup by him. And however, it must be said that the public were supportive of the actions taken by General Khan because uh, of the tales of corruption, the civil bureaucracy, and the public administration and maligned the democratic process in the country. So this is what can hurt democracy in a country if the people who are elected do not fulfill their promises. People might just want to give power to a single strongman dictator. So this is uh, slowly, which just shows how the military regime was starting to come to an end, but it continued until 1969. 1969 to 71, there, then President General Yahya Khan was aware of the explosive political situation in the country. There was support for progressive and socialist groups, which was rising, and calls for a change of regime were gaining momentum. In a television address to the nation, President Khan announced his intention to hold nationwide elections. So, this is the end of military rule. The Election Commission registered 24 political parties, and public meetings attracted many large crowds. On the eve of the elections, a cyclone struck East Pakistan, killing approximately 500,000 people. Very tragic. Though this event did not deter people from participating in the first ever general election. This is remarkable that the people of Pakistan, East Pakistan specifically, had such support for democracy at that time. And from 1971 to 77, there was a second democratic era. The People's Party of Pakistan came to power. They, democratic socialists and visionaries, had authority for the first time in the country's history, and the then, uh, I think he was the president. I'm not sure if he's the president or prime minister. I think he's just prime minister, uh, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He dismissed the chiefs of the army, navy, and air force and ordered house arrest for General Yahya Khan and several of his collaborators. So, this is again a mistake I think that democratically elected governments have made in Pakistan, which was to go and attack the previous military dictatorships. I think it would have been better for them to just let them go and focus on running the country. There should be some forgiveness and amnesty for the previous military rule. Otherwise, the military would again want to come back to power and take revenge on these democratically elected politicians, and the cycle never ends. The PPP created a 1973 constitution with the support of Islamists. This declared Pakistan an Islamic republic and Islam the state religion. Now, of course, Pakistan was created for Muslims, but like I said before, you cannot have a theocracy and a democracy at the same time. They're both antagonistic towards each other. And like I said, going too harsh against the military rulers in the previous administration would lead to a backlash, and it indeed did. 1977 to 88, there was a period of military rule, and this was regarded as a period of persecution and the growth of state sponsored religious conservatism. This was the under President of Pakistan, Zia ul Haq. He committed himself to establishing an Islamic state and enforcing Sharia law. Separate electorates for Hindus and Christians were established in 1985. However, Christian and Hindu leaders complained that they felt excluded from the country's political process. So, this is the problem with forcing a religion onto a multi religious country. Other communities that don't subscribe to the government sponsored religion will be discriminated. And then in 1988 to 99, there was a third democratic era. This was held after this general elections in 1988 were held after President Ziaul Haq's death. The elections marked the return of the People's Party to power. Their leader, Benazir Bhutto, became the first female Prime Minister of Pakistan, and as well as the first female head of government in Muslim majority country. It featured a fierce competition between center-right conservatives led by Nawaz Sharif and center-left socialists led by Benazir Bhutto. And the far left and the far right disappeared from the political arena. And this has kind of been these have been the two main political parties in Pakistan till today, until Imran Khan came onto the scene and won power. defeating both of them. But now he's out of power, which I've spoken about in a previous video. You'll see the link to that on the screen. And Pakistan is still under civilian control, but the army is slowly once again taking over power. I don't know how Pakistan can get out of this cycle of civilian and military control. Now let's talk about democracy in Sri Lanka. It is a semi presidential representative democratic republic where the president of Sri Lanka is both the head of the state and head of government, and it relies on a multi party system. This is a very complicated system, and I think it's unnecessarily complicated to have the president as both head of state and head of government. It's given him too much power, and because there's also a prime minister, there's sometimes disputes between the president and prime minister. The president is elected for a 5 year term, and the election occurs under the Sri Lankan form, the contingent vote. And Sri Lanka has never been under military rule, and unlike Pakistan, so it's better that way. It has its parliament has 225 members elected for a 5 year term, 196 members elected in multi state constituencies, and 29 by proportional representation. And of course, now the situation in Sri Lanka is very tenuous. Uh, Gotabaya Rajapaksa won the previous election. So yeah, Gotabaya Rajapaksa has lost power and he left the country along with Mahinda Rajapaksa and the rest of their cabinet. And this was done but because people protested against them after the economic collapse that occurred earlier this year, which I've spoken about in a previous video. You'll see that video link on the screen. These protesters were called the Aragalia. They are unusual in that they welcome Sri Lankans from all ethnic backgrounds. They protested in April outside the presidential secretariat. They included activists from the Muslim community and also commemorated Tamil civilians who died during the last stages of the war. So this shows that this is a more liberal group. Now, the question is whether these protesters also voted for Rajapaksa in the 2019 election. I found no evidence for or against that, so I can't say whether this was truly a popular movement, but I can say it had a lot of support. And I just can't say whether it's a majority opinion or not. And the civil war basically created a great divide between the Sinhala Buddhist majority and the minority Tamils. And the terrorist attack in 2019 on Easter by some Muslims was basically caused a divide between Muslims and the rest of Sri Lankans. And the fact that these protesters are including people from all communities gives them a chance to renegotiate their communal bonds and relationships and construct a new collective identity. Uh, Sri Lanka's problems with democracy won't, I think, destroy it. I think that with the new government in power, if it shows that they can recover the country from the economic crisis it's in, then people will maintain their faith in democracy. And now let's talk about Nepal. The Nepalese democracy movement was the combination of a series of political initiatives and movements from the 20th century to 2008 that advocated the establishment of representative democracy, a multi party political system, and the abolition of monarchy in Nepal. Uh, this began with the ousting of the Ranas, the long established Nepalese royal family, in the mid 20th century. This period of democracy ended in the 1960s and the panchayat system of government was introduced. More on that here. Uh, the king introduced the panchayat system of governance, which was after he re-established his power. This restructured political power to the king. Elections were held at a communal level. Panchayat legislation formally guaranteed freedom of speech, but it was restricted to a number of royal laws, including uh, laws that prohibited critique of the royal family. So we can see that this was an attempt to re-establish the control of the monarchy, the royal family over Nepal. This ended in 1990 when a coalition of seven political factions and a political party called the Nepali Congress led a process of reintroduction of democracy in Nepal. In April 1990, students, human rights organizations, and professional unions staged protests led to the closure of universities and schools. The protests culminated in the first Janna Andolan, or People's Movement, which pressurized the king to reinstate multi party democracy. The constitution was established and declared Nepal as a Hindu state with Khasa Nepali as official language, despite Nepal's poly-religious and linguistic population. This was a mistake. I think not the establishing a Hindu state, but making one language as official language is a mistake. They should have allowed all the spoken languages in Nepal to be official languages, would have been more inclusive of the various linguistic groups. Then in nine, but this was still not real democracy. The royal family still had control. This led to in 1996 to a Maoist insurgency, a violent campaign to overthrow the political economic status quo, redistribute land, and effect a proletarian revolution in Nepal. Basically, typical communist stuff. This was a civil war which caused human rights violations and killings of more than 13,000 people, as well as a decline in Nepal's GDP growth rate, fueled by a drop in tourist arrivals and the destruction of infrastructure. King Birendra and his family was assassinated in 2001, and the multi-party democracy was placed under a state of emergency. Uh, the civil war developed into a military and political stalemate that ended in 2005. Protests against the political and economic situation drew 1 lakh to 2 lakhs and 5 million in Kathmandu and 5 million in the entire country. And democracy was established. We can see the latest round of democracy that occurred a few days, a month ago in Nepal in the elections. The election commission has submitted a report to president that the new government is set to form power, but as far they've still not yet formed government, and it will take a few weeks until 2023. And I think this is a problem in Nepal that uh, the parties that win the elections or that have more seats should immediately be allowed to uh, announce that they're in power and get the government started. This process of waiting for them to take power is leads to insecurity amongst the people and causes um, uh, too much of a pause in the governance of the country. So as far as Nepal goes, with now that they're having regular elections, I think that democracy in their country will continue to grow and will become more secure as time goes by. Bhutan, like Nepal, had a monarchy and also a democratic movement for democracy. The first democratic elections in Bhutan began in 2007, and at all levels of government had been democratically elected by 2011. The king of Bhutan voluntarily relinquished his control over the country and allowed elections and democracy to take place in Bhutan. The process of modernization and democratization was initiated by the third king of Bhutan, Jigme Dorji Wangchuk, ruled from 27th October till 1952 till 21st July 1972. Then the fourth king of Bhutan from 72 to 2006 planned and oversaw many of the political and legal reforms that have shaped the constitutional monarchy and democracy in Bhutan. On the other hand, he sought also the enactment of restrictive citizenship laws and increased emphasis on cultural asimilarity laws. I don't even know what these are about, so I won't talk about them. Since the abdication of the fourth king, the head of state has retained the regal title but no longer reigns with absolute power. The reign of the fifth and current king of Bhutan, uh, Jigme Khesar Namgyel Wangchuk, has seen the enactment of the constitution in 2008, as well as the democratic elections of both houses of parliament and three levels of local government. So, Bhutan has had successive elections and they're doing well as far as I know. And I think, like Nepal, they will continue to get better at democracy. And finally, I want to talk about Bangladesh. Bangladesh, like Pakistan, has been often under military rule, shifting between civilian and military rule. And this has prevented democracy from really taking firm hold. And electoral reforms, free, fair, and credible elections are needed to create a government representing the will of the people. In Bangladesh, there's a lot of corruption in the elections, which needs to end. And this causes people to not respect the government that comes to power. So, according to this essay, Bangladesh must frame a law in accordance with the constitutional mandate that will allow credible elections to take place, and they need to appoint an election commission with competent and neutral individuals. India's election commission has done great service in uh, conducting elections and spreading democracy in India. And I think such an institution will help Bangladesh. There must be an election time government without a neutral government which controls the bureaucracy and the law enforcement agency during elections. Fair elections are not possible. India does not have a neutral government, but what happens is that the election commission imposes a model code of conduct which prevents the government from passing any new laws or introducing any new policies when the election is taking place. So this keeps the government and the opposition parties at a even scale for both of them. The parliament must become independent and effective. The parliament members must focus on lawmaking and not be involved in local development. The judiciary must be independent, and there must be an expert committee formed to recommend constitutional amendments. So we can see that democracy has had varied success in South Asia. Oh, before I want to finally end with talk about India. India has had a pretty good uh, democratic record. In fact, it's the only country in South Asia where democracy was never, where was always there from the last 70 years. Even during the emergency imposed by Indira Gandhi, the constitution was not uh, removed from effect and was still in place, which allowed the judiciary to impose some controls on the government, whatever, however limited. And eventually that was lifted and Congress lost. So that shows that people did not support dictatorship in India and that they support democracy. So in India, democracy is going to continue and get better, more deep rooted, but it also has its problems like corruption and uh, attacks on the press and stuff like that. But it's on its way to becoming a mature liberal democracy. And so I think, except for Pakistan and Afghanistan, I'm confident of democracy in South Asia, including in unstable countries like Sri Lanka. I think that the people in these countries support democracy and it will continue to be the main political system. So, yeah, that's what I hope and what I think will happen in the future. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to see other videos about South Asia, click here. If you want to see my previous videos, click here. If you want to see the sources I use for this video, click the links in the description below. Thank you for watching.